The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar today. In the next half hour or so, I'll be talking with Professor Michael Abramowicz, who is a professor of law at the George Washington University and author of the book Predictocracy, Market Mechanisms for Public and Private Decision-Making. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to email them to events@predictit.org. So just a little bit about Michael. So Michael specializes in law and economics, spanning areas including intellectual property, civil procedure, corporate law, administrative law, and insurance law. And his research has been published in many notable law reviews. His book, Predictocracy, explores how prediction markets can be applied to a range of public and private institutions, from legislatures to corporations. So thank you so much for joining us today, Michael.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be talking to you, Aubrey.
Great. So why don't you start telling us about a little bit about your background. So how did you become interested in prediction markets?
Well, so I was interested in becoming a law professor and looking for something to write about. But I actually didn't start with prediction markets. I actually came to that. One thing that kind of I realized is that markets and law both have a similarity in that they both process information. And in fact, one way that you can think about law is that law is a set of algorithms, a set of procedures that transform information and also people's preferences into policy. And of course, markets are doing much the same thing, transforming information and preferences into prices and affecting decisions. And so I started thinking about the question of whether sometimes law might work better if it looked more like a market or incorporated more market mechanisms than it currently does. And that kind of led me to eventually, to finding a little bit of literature on prediction markets. There wasn't very much back then, and to exploring the field.
That's really great, and obviously with your book that you've definitely contributed to that literature. So yeah, that's really interesting. I never really thought about the cross section between what law and prediction markets have in common in that way. So it's very cool. And so I guess we can just kind of dive into our topic for today. Talking about policy prediction markets, or prediction markets applied to the field of policy analysts. So, those are people that are scholars and thinkers who are working to analyze public policy in places such as think tanks and universities. So, can you tell us a little bit about what the setup of a prediction market might look like in this field?
Sure. So, I talk a little bit about the book, right? How lots of different kinds of institutions could use prediction markets, and you could imagine think tanks or universities organizing collections of scholars or collections of other experts or potentially other people who want to participate as well to engage in prediction markets on specific topics. And so there's been some recent work, for example, by people like Xiling Su talking about how you might have a prediction market for climate change. And one question might be, to what extent do people who are really working on the models related to climate change think that certain kinds of outcomes are likely to happen over different kinds of time periods, whether a couple of years, 10 years, et cetera, further down the line? And so you could structure a prediction market so that the payoffs of a kind of prediction market security would depend ultimately on things like average global temperature, weather events, other kinds of weather events, and so forth.
Very interesting. And so part of what you mentioned about prediction markets for policy organizations is that they might be funded as opposed to people using their own money like they do on Predictit. So for a professional setting like this, who would be funding that policy prediction market?
Sure. So you could imagine a situation in which people are potentially participating with their own money, and you might provide some kind of a subsidized prediction market, which maybe we can talk about a little bit later, to encourage them to be willing to put a little bit of their own money at risk. But many corporations, for example, in setting up internal corporate prediction markets to make forecasts about things like when products will be ready, have provided employees with some money or some points or something to wager. And so if you had an organization that was committed to creating a prediction market, whether it's on climate change, whether it's to forecast economic indicators or prison populations, I mean, you can think of any kind of thing that there might be interest in forecasting for policy purposes. You could imagine somebody essentially saying, look, I'm going to provide you with points or with real money to bet in this market.
Very interesting. And so, you know, why exactly might some policy analysis organization, you know, why exactly would they sponsor a prediction market for their organization?
Well, I think certainly one of the guiding principles of prediction markets is that talk is cheap. But when people are willing to actually back up their views with money, we can find out a little bit more what those individuals collectively believe. And when lots of people are doing this, we can obtain some kind of group consensus. And so especially when there's some kind of controversy about whether people really believe something or whether they're making some kind of predictions for political reasons or for other kinds of reasons, if you think that you really want to get at the truth of what people really believe, when they're motivated, not just, you know, to say things that will impress other people, but when they're motivated financially, then you might want to have a prediction market because that provides a more kind of credible view to the world. And you might even put people on very different sides of an issue on such a prediction market. See, well, what happens when they get together? How much do people really think what they claim? And this kind of reflects a history in which sometimes people challenge each other to bets. They say, you know, from the playground to the halls of academia, there are occasions in which people say, you really think that's the case? Let's bet on it. And prediction market is just a way of betting much more systematically and finding group predictions that are credible, right? If people really are putting their money behind something, some kind of prediction, let's say about climate change, then somebody else is an outsider who may not know, are these people, do they really think that the temperatures are going to, you know, go up that many degrees? Well, if they see that the prediction market says so, they may be, at least if they understand prediction markets, which may be a big if, they may be somewhat more inclined to believe that at least that the belief is credible.
Huh, that's interesting. I really like what you said about, you know, putting people on different sides of an issue. So, for example, climate change, people, you know, who, you know, maybe think that climate change is, you know, inevitable, and then some people on the other side of that. But and so when you think about, you know, a lot of policy organizations, you know, policy organizations a lot of time include think tanks, and so a lot of the think tanks are ideologically driven, and they obviously have like their own agendas that they're pushing. And so, do you think that it's possible that the policy analysis market could be manipulated by an organization that has, you know, certain political viewpoints?
Well, I think that if you only have people of one mindset participating in a prediction market, that may affect the results on the margin. But as soon as you start to get more of a mixture, I think you're likely to at least get sort of the genuine kind of consensus belief of that group. And I think sometimes when people are really forced to confront issues, their actual real consensus belief may not be quite as far from the real consensus belief of somebody on the other side. You spoke specifically about manipulation, and that's an interesting area. I mean, you might imagine, let's imagine that we had a prediction market on with super high stakes. Let's suppose this is pretty fanciful, but let's imagine that we said, you know, election day is kind of a big pain. Everybody has to go and vote. So why don't we just flip a coin on election day? And if it's heads, we'll go ahead with the election. If it's tails, we'll just take prediction of who's going to win, and we'll just have that person. Be president, and we'll just all save the trouble of voting. Obviously, we're not going to do this, but I think it's a nice example to show. Well, if we did that, then suddenly prediction markets or other prediction markets wouldn't just be about making forecasts, but they're actually potentially deciding things. And there's been some talk, actually, even with political prediction markets in our real world, that maybe the information that the prediction markets provide actually has some kind of effect, like polls do in the conversation, moving some people in a particular direction. Right? We've seen in this election cycle, obviously, that Donald Trump, for example, has used polls to sort of further his momentum in the Republican primaries. And prediction markets, if they get enough attention, can have some of that effect too. And so that raises the question, can people manipulate them because they want to affect publicity? Because, in a somewhat fanciful example, very fanciful example I gave, because they might actually want to affect the election. And there have been some studies of this. And I think the general result is that it's very hard to manipulate prediction markets, because if you're willing to sort of pour money onto one side of a market, there will be other people who perceive that you are doing that and will take the other side of the bet. Now, that doesn't mean you can't necessarily manipulate at all. I think if people don't realize you're manipulating, they think you really honestly believe something, and they don't realize that there are incentives to manipulate, you're likely to move market price a little bit. But once people realize that there are incentives to manipulate, then when some people are manipulating, some other people are going to take the opposite end of that bet. So, I mean, you could imagine, what if Bill Gates decided to put, billions of dollars on the proposition that, I don't know, the Green Party will win the presidential election? Could he make the prediction market so that it's actually a pretty high number? And I think the answer is no, because however much money he has, the rest of the potential market has much more money. And once people realize, hey, Bill Gates is out there willing to put up his money to make on a crazy proposition, people on the other side would be willing to take the other side of that bet. So I think prediction markets, certainly you could affect them on the margins, but out and out manipulation is very difficult.
Well, that's interesting. So going on a little bit more about how you were talking about, people kind of, sticking with their gut and actually, buying and selling for, what they believe in the market. So, with, Predictit, traders are, using their own money to, invest in the market. So, with with a policy prediction market that's going to be, potentially funded, by somebody else, do you think that the traders' motivation will be different than if they would be using, their own money that was on the line?
Well, I think so some of what I'm imagining is that third-party organizations might fund a prediction market, but then it becomes real funds, right? So if somebody actually gives you $20 and says, hey, here's $20, go ahead and play with this on the prediction market, but you get to walk home with the money, then I think that provides a pretty ample financial incentive. The question becomes, what happens if there's no real money? What happens if it's play money? And there have been some studies that suggest that even some of these kind of play money markets, like some of the early versions of the Hollywood Stock Exchange, where people were predicting how much particular movies would gross, even a lot of those were quite successful and quite accurate in terms of forecasting outcomes. But I certainly think you're going to get bigger incentives for people to be honest, and greater incentives, moreover, for people to actually do research and really think through issues very carefully, the more real money they have on the line, whether that's money from somebody else that's given it to them, or whether that was just money in their pocket that they've voluntarily decided to put into a prediction market.
And so kind of going off of that, so, we're talking a little bit about, the decisions that, people make, whether it's with their own money or someone that subsidizes it. But, you talk a little bit about your book about how prediction markets aggregate, two types of information. One type is the evidence that someone uses to make a particular prediction, and then the other is the predictive assessment that any particular individual makes on the basis of that evidence. So can you give us some examples about what those two types of information look like?
Sure. So I think we could think about that just in the context of a political prediction market about a presidential election. We get certainly raw data comes in the forms of polls. Maybe you could think of it in the forms of news. But also sometimes people come out with new studies. Right? Nate Silver on 538 comes out with a new analysis of the election. And I think both of those have the potential to move the market. I think the political markets are so liquid, that probably the market's already incorporating a lot of what Nate Silver is going to say, a lot of the analysis that he has before he's actually done it. But especially if you think about some areas in which maybe there's a lot less information, when some kind of study comes out, when somebody's assessment comes out of available information, that might be quite relevant. So let's just take a kind of a banal example. Let's imagine that a prediction market is used to forecast the number of kids in a particular school district who are going to be going in the school 10 years, in the school system 10 years later, right? Which is something school districts need to know this. They need to make planning in terms of how many buildings to build and so on. And it's actually, I think if you just look at local politics, an area in which frequently they don't do a very good job, even though they hire consultants and the like. And I think when you take an area like that, or any kind of area, you know, if you just kind of come initially and tell people to say, well, what do you think is going to happen? You know, their predictions might be all over the map. I mean, they might say, well, this is an area that's growing or not growing, and they might kind of come up with quick assessments. But if new data comes in, a new census, for example, that might be useful. And then you might imagine somebody doing some kind of really good analysis. Somebody might say, okay, well, we've done a statistical study comparing lots of different municipalities to determine how all these municipalities have grown over time and what kinds of factors affect growth of school districts. And based on that analysis, we have this projection. So that's, I think, an example in which once a good study comes out, that is probably going to move the market quite a bit, right? So it's not just kind of the raw data saying, okay, now there's this many people in the town. It's also somebody's statistical study, somebody's other kind of thoughtful analysis on how to think about a particular problem. That can move prediction markets too. And that becomes more important as we start getting into thinking about using prediction markets for legal issues. Once we're starting to think that a prediction market could be used to make a forecast that is of interest legally, we might be talking about a lot of, you know, kind of boring things. Presidential elections are fun. There's lots of things that prediction markets might be used to forecast that are boring, but that also are kind of problems that are amenable to careful analysis. And so if you have prediction markets with enough incentives, you actually give people incentives to do some of that analysis, but because they can do the analysis, they can trade on it, and then they can reveal their information to the prediction market.
Wow, yeah, I think that is really, that really brings up a good point. So what I was just thinking about when you were, you know, talking about doing analysis for things that, you know, might be like, quote unquote, the boring markets, I was kind of thinking about the long-term markets that prediction markets sometimes tend to have. So, you know, for example, you know, people on Predictit, some of them have been in our, you know, who's going to win the presidency market for, you know, since the beginning of the fight. So, you know, in terms of, you know, a policy prediction market, you know, what are some of those, you know, long-term markets that we might see, and what do you think could be the effect of, you know, people participating and moving those markets?
So I think there's lots of possibilities for long-term prediction markets used by legal institutions and maybe also by private organizations like Predictit. I mean, obviously, you guys could have a prediction market. I don't know if you do. Do you have one yet on the 2020 presidential race?
I think we might. I'm not sure yet, but I think we might.
2024.
Yeah,
exactly. It's very interesting to see how some of those move with changes of information as well. But I also think that in law it can be useful. And one of the things that I actually focus on my book, and this comes back to what we were talking about at first, about how law and markets both are used to aggregate information and preferences, is I talk about the possibility of using markets that can be used to forecast not sort of raw objective numbers, but that could be used to forecast judgments that people might make at some point in the future. So, for example, I talk about something that I call predictive cost-benefit analysis. So for lots of governmental policies we have that the government is considering, a government agency will do a cost-benefit analysis. And one of the criticisms of cost-benefit analysis is that it's extremely manipulable. If it's a Republican administration, you're going to get one result. If it's a Democratic administration, you're going to get another, because you can disagree about lots of the assumptions that go into the cost-benefit analysis. And so you might imagine a world in which we say, well, we don't like policy just kind of going back and forth just depending on who happens to be in the White House, or cost-benefit analyses that are just totally politicized. We'd like to have a less political cost-benefit analysis. And what you might do then is you might say, well, what we're going to do is we're going to arrange for 10 years from now, let's say, somebody's going to do a cost-benefit analysis, kind of thinking retrospectively on this issue. Now, one benefit of that is there will be lots of new information in the next 10 years. But there's another benefit, which I think is a little more subtle, which is that we don't know who's going to be doing that. We'll have somebody in the government do it, but we don't know in 10 years whether we're going to have a Democratic administration or a Republican administration. And so if you're trying to guess what the outcome of that cost-benefit analysis will be, you kind of make some kind of probability-weighted adjustment. You say, well, maybe it's a Republican, maybe it's a Democrat, who knows, maybe we finally have an independent candidate win the presidency. And so you kind of think about what would be an average cost-benefit analysis. And so this is how prediction markets can really be used to aggregate preferences. If we have a prediction market forecasting this cost-benefit analysis 10 years from now, the prediction market itself is going to be sort of depoliticizing by giving an average of what we think different administrations might say on the particular issue. And so I think that's a really important way in which we can use kind of the long term to our advantage to say, well, when we focus on things that are too short term, if we're just focusing on a decision in the short term, that decision itself might be politicized. But if we really focus on something long way out, we don't know, sure, there will be some bias in that eventual decision. But thinking about it now, our anticipation of the different possible biases sort of cancels out. And so this can be kind of a nice measure of what an average, well-informed person today thinks about a particular issue.
That's really interesting. So going on to our next topic, I think that we would be remiss without talking about the policy analysis market sponsored by DARPA. So can you kind of give us a summary about what happened with that, and maybe the lessons that we might be taught in setting up a future policy-based prediction market?
Sure. So it was an interesting project. It was really designed to predict lots of variables, including dominantly things like economic variables, military variables about the Middle East. But there was some discussion, and this was actually DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is a very, they've sponsored lots of interesting things like competition for autonomous cars and so forth, tried to set up such a market, basically to try to think, would this be something that could be useful in our foreign policy and our defense policy to make better predictions for the future? And in the materials for this market, they mentioned almost parenthetically, well, you could predict whether somebody's going to get assassinated, and a couple other examples like that. And that led to a political uproar. Some senators said, this is what we're spending our government's money on. We're encouraging people to bet on whether people are going to be assassinated. And the project was very quickly dismantled. And so certainly I think this reflects a broader problem, which is that I think people, when they think about prediction markets, they often think about gambling, and they think, oh, well, maybe that's something that we've traditionally thought of as bad. And of course, I think there can certainly be problems with, let's say, sports gambling, especially if people are in over their heads, but that markets in general, when we think about the stock market and so forth, produce lots of very valuable information. And prediction markets can be used to produce really valuable information. But given sort of the political sensitivities, the government obviously needs to be careful about how they define prediction markets, what kinds of projects they include, and what kinds of things might just sound kind of bad to keep in the market.
Wow. Yeah, so I think that's a very good point. And so we are about 5 minutes away from the end, so I wanted to make a call to anybody who is interested in asking Michael a question about policy prediction markets, you can send your questions to events@predicted.org. I have one question here, and so basically this person is asking, in a policy-based prediction market, what is stopping, someone that's, from a lobbying organization or super PAC or the like, from popping up a particular issue or candidate in the prediction market?
Well, nothing necessarily is stopping them, except that in a sense it can be counterproductive. If somebody tries to really prop up one side, it comes back to the example I was talking about with Bill Gates trying to advance the Green Party. If somebody's really pushing something that is just clearly wrong, clearly it's just not a very good prediction, essentially that's just an invitation for other people to take their money and to take the other side of that bet. And so that's why I think it's just very hard to manipulate over the long term. If people will make the bet, the organization propping it up will have lost some of its money. If they don't know that you're doing it, if they think, oh, maybe these bets, we don't know where they're coming from, maybe they reflect some really genuine assessment, that's likely to move the market a little bit. But if people have a sense that, oh, somebody's trying to prop up the market, that's very unlikely to be successful.
Interesting. And so another question that's coming from one of our listeners. So we were talking a little bit about subsidizing prediction markets, where the organization might sponsor a policy prediction market. And so this person wants to know about, encouraging active participation in the market. Does someone who is participating in this market, what exactly inspires them to, be a little bit more active than like the average trader, let's say?
So in existing markets or in hypothetically subsidized markets?
I think in a hypothetical one.
Yeah, so I think as we start thinking about subsidized markets, we start imagining a different maybe composition of traders, probably less people who are excited about the particular topic, who just really enjoy, let's say, politics, and more people who are really trying to participate with the goal of making money. Because if a prediction market is subsidized, then on average the participants will actually make money. Whereas with existing prediction markets, if they charge commissions, obviously on average people are going to lose money just by definition. And so the way a subsidized prediction market works is typically they're not markets that actually match individual traders to each other. Rather, they use a mechanism in which essentially the house is always available to trade at the current price, at least an infinitesimal amount of money at the current price, with anybody. And when they trade, that moves the current price. And so everybody's trading with the house. The house is the subsidizer, and not directly with each other. So whenever you trade with the house, that moves the price in one direction or the other, and that's how these prediction markets work. So there will be different composition of traders, and also I think a fundamentally different mechanism. One advantage of this mechanism is we don't have to worry about really large bid-ask spreads. So sometimes on a market where there's just not very much liquidity, you have huge bid-ask spreads. The market doesn't give a lot of information. With subsidized prediction markets, that's not really an issue. There's always one particular price, and anybody on either side can trade with the house at that price. And that's sort of built into the subsidy regime.
That's really great. Okay, well, that's all the time that we have today for our webinar. But Michael, I'd like to give you a big thank you for joining us and sharing your insights with us this morning.
Thank you, Abramowicz. I really appreciate the excellent questions.
Great, and thanks to all of you also, who joined us today on the webinar. I hope you're having a great experience with Predicted. Hope that you're making some great trades. And so for those of you listening, if you have any suggestions on who else you'd like to see as a featured guest on one of our webinars or online events, please send your feedback to events@predicted.org. So thanks so much, everybody, and I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.